Hi, and welcome back to Biblical Theology, Exegesis, and Hermeneutics, where meaning is always context-driven. I'm your host, John Strazicich, and today we will be continuing on in our study here in the book of Romans, and today we'll be looking here at verses 19 to 24. So if you have your Bibles, go ahead and open them up. Okay, then coming then to this slide, we will offer up a translation of the text here beginning in verse 19, and then we will look at a little bit of structure. Therefore shall you say to me, why does he yet find fault? For who has resisted his will, or his plan, or his counsel for bulemati here? O man, on the contrary, who are you who answers back to God? Shall that which is formed say to the one who formed, why have you made me in this way? Or does not the potter have authority over the clay to make from the same lump one a vessel for honor and another for dishonor? But if God, desiring to demonstrate wrath and to make known his power, bore in much patience vessels of wrath which have been, as we said before, repurposed, retooled, reformed, fitted for destruction. Some type of translation such as that here. And in order that he might make known the riches of his glory upon vessels of mercy, which he has prepared beforehand for glory. Us also, whom he called not only from the Jews, but also from the Gentiles. So you can see here in this last verse, it definitely, we need to include verse 24 here. In this, because he wants to reach all the way here to include with these vessels of mercy the Gentiles, and groups them in here with the Jews here. So typically he's been using the term Israel, but here he says Jews, quite rare here in 9 to 11. And so there's a lot going on here, and this is, note here that this is all the elusive use of Scripture here. Nowhere does he state here, as the Scripture says, or introduces a scriptural quotation, but he makes the use of allusion. He's making midrashic complexes here. A midrashic complex is the bringing together of one or two scriptural verses and creating a new whole out of it. And it's a way to to build up a motif in Paul's building of his theology here, and this is quite common in Second Temple Judaism, and we definitely have the appropriation here and resignification of Scripture going on here. But what we have here is we can see here, it's entitled here the second twofold objection and Paul's diatribal midrashic response to God's selective mercy and hardening, and this will go all the way from 19 to 29, but the first unit here is going to go all the way to verse 24, from 19 to 24. And so Paul here is, he has these anticipatory objections of the Jewish interlocutor here in verse 19. And we can see that it is, somewhat, we could say somewhat hostile here. And remember last time when we looked at Jewett and et al. With the academy, that they were trying to follow Stowers with that, following, looking at the work of that Stowers did in, within the Greco-Roman world, looking at various works, that he saw that the interlocutor worked as a cordial person, or it wasn't a person of contention, and so the imaginary interlocutor, what was used in the text to cause the progression of the didactic teaching of the author to move it forward, and it was a way to move forward the argumentation of the text, and that is what's going on here. But the interlocutor here would be a Jewish person, and when Paul got into heated discussions with his Jewish compatriots, it usually ended up where he had to separate the newly formed believers in Messiah, to separate them from the synagogue, and then to start his messianic synagogue, and so that is what is most likely going on here as well. And another thing, it's important to bring up when we come here, the author here, Paul, was talking about the selective purposes of God in the patriarchal period concerning God's elective purposes that worked in according to calling, and that stopped at verse 13, because once we came, like last week, looking at verses 14 and following, we're involved in a contemporary then interpretation of Paul and his interlocutor, and that's what we're still caught up in. And then because last week we looked at that the provocative language of election and the using of the phrase coming out of Malachi, Jacob I loved and Esau I hated, it stirred up within within Paul's interlocutor some questions concerning whether is God acting here in an unjust manner, because he was offended, as we saw last week, because it wasn't in accordance with works. Okay, and we saw that from the phrase there that it's not from the one who wills or from the one who runs, but of God who has mercy. Okay, and so that when you go especially to verse 30 or 32, you'll see that he says there that the Jews are pursuing the law of righteousness, which they didn't attain to. So it's using the term of it's some kind of like maybe athletic competition of running, and so the strong desire and running, this would be typified by works, that the Paul's Jewish compatriots were running in their contest to attain the righteousness of the law. And we've already seen that Paul is saying, has told us earlier in his letter that, that nobody is going to be justified from the works of the law. And in, chapter 7, he said that the fact that the giving of the law just brought up all the more frustration, that because when he knew that the law, what the law said is it instilled death in him instead of life, because the law was weak in that the flesh could not the flesh of man could not produce the righteousness of God. And so this is why Paul introduced the Spirit, and then Christ energizing us with the Spirit. It enables us then to fulfill the law. And so this is what's going to eventually it's going to develop into. But this was part of the, you need to be able to understand, from the little hints that were given back there, in 14 to 18 that we looked at last time. And also, back in, I believe it was 12, where it says not of works, but of the one who calls. So that was all like preparatory, and when you come to 9:30 following, then all of that language becomes, it goes, oh, that's what Paul was talking about. That's what he meant by that. And it, so you got to read it forward, and then read it backward, and then it becomes plain. So that's why it's very important that we, when we're looking here at chapter 9, we got to look at all of 9 to 11 in a whole, so that you're properly understanding the, like the moniker says, meaning is always context driven. And so the meaning is in situ. It's in place. It's situated in the text, and then you have to then extrapolate the words from their placement on the page, and in its relation to other words. So that is why the moniker for the platform is meaning is always context driven, and that's so important. Okay, so we'll move on. Okay, then coming here then to this slide, we will get back to some grammatical issues here, and then beginning here in verse 19, and we look here, we have un here on stilts, and this is a coordinated conjunction of inference. So it's going to draw an inference from what Paul had just been talking about in 14 to 18, and it was all summarized in verse 18. Upon some he shows mercy, and on some he hardens, and that was basically the interpretation there that was given by Paul, and that itself was extrapolated out of the unit from 6 to 13 that culminated in the election of Jacob over Esau, and that all consummated with Jacob I loved and Esau I hated. And so that drew an inference there in 14 that then Paul went on to double down and basically say that that God not only in the patriarchal period had an elective purpose that was in accordance with calling, because we saw that in when was it here in verse where it said and we'll just say we'll supply, you have to supply the word twins, when the twins were not yet born, neither having done anything good or bad, in order that the purpose of God in accordance with election might continue, not of works, but of the one who calls. Okay, so that the God's purpose of election works in accordance with calling, and we just saw that remember we ended with verse 24 here, where it says also us whom he called, not only of the Jews but also of the Gentiles. So here the Gezerah Shava comes back through the word kaleo here, calling, and as we know, Paul later says here that in chapter 11 that the Gentiles stand by their faith. And so they're called, but and they stand by their faith. So that is you really you have to be able to read these texts, and they're very it's using Paul's using Gezerah Shava here. So when we come here to verse 24, where it says us also whom he called, not only of the Jews but also of the Gentiles. Well, that goes straight back to to verse 12, where it says when they were not yet born, either having done anything good or bad, in order that the purpose of God according to election might continue, not of being not of works, but of the one who calls. So we already saw that God called Jacob at Luz, that he called it Bethel. He saw in that dream he had that ladder that was went to in his dream, that went from Bethel to heaven, and the angels of God were ascending and descending upon it, and God said that he was going to give the promise of Abraham to him, and that he was going to give him the land, and that he would bring him back safely. And so this whole process of election, that God's creating a nation through through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and there's only three people at this point in time. So you got to remember that Abraham was alive at the time of Jacob and Esau. Okay, Abraham was 100 years old when he gave birth to Isaac. Isaac was 60 when he gave birth to Jacob and Esau. So Abraham was at that time 160, and we know that Abraham lived to 185 years. So he saw the boys until they were almost 50, basically 15, or somewhere right around there, 15 years old. So at this time, there's only Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So you got a nation start somewhere. So we to talk about, we already talked about that last week with Mu, but we saw that how the nation started there with Jacob, and but the important point here to draw is in verse 24. Us also whom he called, not only of the Jews but also of the Gentiles. That's a Gezerah Shava. that goes back to, this word calling that's been used repeatedly, but it goes back there to verse 12. Not of works, but of the one who calls. Okay, so that's very important, and so we know that a part of election is calling, and now we can see it's very clear here in verse 24. Us also whom he called. So there's a calling and there's a response, and we know that Paul later says to the Gentiles, you stand by faith. So your faith and your response of faith is is how you're saved. With the mouth, man confesses, with the heart he believes to salvation. And you can go back to to the Gospel of John, chapter 1. As many as received him, to them he gave power to become the children of God, to those who believe in his name. Okay, and they're not born of blood, nor are they born of the will of man, but they're born of God. And we'll see here, we've already seen here about the will of man. Abraham tried to, produce, he said, well, let Ishmael live before you, and God said, no, it's going to be the seed of promise. So these are all questions here that have to be talked about, and all have to be brought on the table here as we come here, because this here is basically, this whole discussion's going to end here in by the time you get to verse 24 here, because then we're going to go back to the question of the Gentiles' inclusion and Israel's that the nations are included in the family of God, and that's what Paul will develop in verses 25 to 29. But here, all of these questions here are important, and I wanted to raise this, and I wanted to especially make the mark here that election is in accordance with the one who calls. So God has a purpose in according to election, and then he calls. and so God here he chose and elected this Abraham and his seed, and they answered the call. Abraham heard God's voice, and he left not knowing where he was going, and he went by faith. Okay, and that's how this whole thing's happened. It's happened by God calling men and them responding, and that God chose and knew in accordance with election that the election would stand through the seed of Jacob versus the seed of Esau, and we saw that with Esau, that it confirmed it. Verse 13, Jacob I love, Esau I hated, because God ended up genociding the country of Edom because of their sinful character, just like he had he did the same to the Amorites. The children of Israel were in bondage for 400 years, and God couldn't give the land to Abraham at that time because the sins of the Amorites were not yet complete. And in the fourth generation, that Abraham's seed would return, and so in the fourth generation, that's typically when, as we saw last time, when when God judges sin, visits the sin upon the third and fourth generation of those who hate Him, and then so Israel was in the grip of Egypt in slavery, and so God's purposes was to bring them back, and Egypt stood in God's way, and so obviously God destroyed Egypt because Egypt was standing in the way of God's purposes of election and the calling of the people whom He chose, and those people who responded by faith to follow, and even the people of faith that didn't follow, Jesus subsequently destroyed them in the wilderness. We saw that last time too from Jude. So I'm sorry for kind of maybe just ranting on here, but it's not really ranting. It's giving a fuller picture of all here that's at stake, and people are going to look at these verses that we're looking at, and that God chooses some to, before the world began, to be chosen to go to heaven, and others are passed over. But if you're not, there's only two places you can end up, heaven or hell. So if he passes over you, that's just a cop-out way of saying, the end result is still the same. You're either going to heaven or you're going to hell, and you had nothing to do with it according to their interpretation of these texts, and that you're doomed from the womb according to Calvin. So, but if you take seriously what I'm telling you here, that election, it's not of works, but of the one who calls. You got to go back there to verses 12 and 13, the one who calls. And that means, and we know what that means when you come here to verse 24, us also whom He called, not only of the Jews but also of the Gentiles. And this is where this is the whole theme of believing in faith in Christ, who justifies you, and where you get salvation. And so it's that simple, folks. It's not that difficult. They do not want to tie the word, the one who calls, that has the same meaning as in verse 24, and it absolutely does. And that's why I went on this entire what you may think was a diversion, but it was actually staying over the target. Okay, then coming back to our diagrammatical analysis, just again, un here is this coordinated conjunction of inference, and so that's it's gonna comment on what he said in 14 to 18, but especially what he did there in verse 18 and in the second half of it, and on some he hardens, because on some God shows mercy, and on others He hardens, and it left it like that. It was meant to be vague, because those questions belong to the Creator, not to the creature. Okay, and I think that's basically where this thing is headed here. And so we have this deliberative question, therefore shall you say to me, and then we have another un, so the postpositive un here is going to then be translated as then here, and we can see this from John Harvey's volume, And if you don't have Harvey's volume here on Romans, it would be good for you to have that in your library. So it says, therefore, shall you say to me then, why does he still find fault? For who, I know this is a perfect, but you can translate it here as present tense. Who resists his counsel or his plan or his purpose? That's how we would translate boulema here, boulemati in the dative here. And so this is a deliberative, future question here that introduces these two interrogative questions here. So the first question comes here in this part of the of verse 19, which would be then, why does he still find fault? And then there's a basis question that comes as a basis for who resists, we'll just say, his plan or his counsel. Okay, and we know that nobody can resist God's counsel, of course. But when we have here this adverb eti here, still, this is now taking it, not looking in the past at these past occurrences. Our interlocutor, is moving on from the Pharaoh example that were this sentence here drew this inference here, right? And this is what caused his question to be answered. And using this temporal adverb, still, or yet, why does he yet find fault? So this is asking why is God still, finding fault? And what this really means is, why is God still hardening? Okay, why is God still hardening? Why is and that is, it's a judgment, and so the you got to understand that hardening is a judgment, and so he's saying, well, if God's hardening, the person, then in their sin, well, then how can then he blame them if God hardened them? Okay, now that is a huge question, and Paul, you should have been able to pick that up from last time, because this whole, in 33:19, Yahweh spoke to Moses, I'll be gracious to whom I'm gracious, and I'll show compassion on whom I'll show compassion. And that was all God speaking to Moses to be prepared that God would reveal his name to Moses. And when he did so, remember on Mount Sinai, because you can't, once you hear 33:19, it's impossible for any reader of the Hebrew Bible not to go to Exodus 34:6, because they know that Exodus 33:19 is just preparatory to the whole revelation that occurs. And this is where, Moses said, hey, God, I want to have favor with you. I want to have favor in your eyes, but I can't have favor unless I know your ways. Okay, so Moses was wanting to be pleasing to God, and he said, I can't be pleasing in your eyes unless I know your ways. And so a part of this revelation is that God now reveals his character to Moses, And when you read Exodus 34, 6 and 7, now you know how to be pleasing to God and how to find favor in his eyes. That's the whole message here. That, you want it, this guy's here wanting to know why God is finding fault. Okay, this guy here should have read the text and says, well, how do I get God's favor? Okay, well, it's by knowing God's character, and here's God's character, and it said, and Yahweh passed over. Well, if you want to use, God passed over certain people. Well, this language is completely different than your language, but I like the biblical language. I don't like your language that comes out of, somebody from, someone called John Calvin. And Yahweh passed before him and proclaimed, Yahweh, Yahweh, God of compassion and graciousness, long-suffering, great in kindness and truth, maintaining kindness to thousands, forgiving iniquity, transgression, and sin, by no means clearing the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children and upon the children's children unto the third and fourth generations. And so if you want to know how to, where God doesn't find fault, well, once you understand here God's character, okay, and that God is a gracious and kind God, he's long-suffering, he's great in loving kindness and truth, he's maintaining loyalty to thousands, he's forgiving iniquity, transgression, and sin. Well, there you go. But here you go. So you want to know why God's finding fault? It's because he's by no means clearing the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the sons, and upon the sons' sons, and to the third and fourth generations. And so the people who persist in their sin are the people whom God hardens. And you're never going to be hardened by God unless you first are sinning against him. And so, you want to know how God hardens, you start sinning. And that's how the book of Romans started off, here in chapter 1, and it goes straight back there to, that God gave them over, paradidomi. He gave them over to their lust. Why? Because they persisted in their sins, and whom people, when they persist in their sin, God gives them over, to uncleanness. That they would defile themselves amongst themselves, and the whole thing goes into, lesbianism and homosexuality and all types of corruption, and basically the generation of woke. So if you want to get hardened by God, well, just get woke, all right, and you will definitely go broke with God, but this is. So Paul doesn't even answer this guy's question, who has resisted his will. I mean, this interlocutor's question that Paul knows that he's going to ask, it all revolves around eti here, this adverbial, temporal, particle here that's modifying the verb here. Why does he yet still find fault? So that this adverb here is telling, this is now contemporizing the message. This whole thing, the whole discussion of 9 to 13 ended there at 13, and ever since verse 14 to the present, we're talking about contemporary interpretation of Paul and his interlocutor, and that's what we've been involved with. We're just in the second part here in this when we come here to verse 19, and then there's a basis for this question, and who has if you translate it with the perfect sense, it's who has resisted his plan, or if following most modern scholars, who resists, put in the present tense, who resists his plan. Well, nobody can. Nobody can resist God's purposes, plans, counsel. If you put yourself in opposition to God's purposes, then you are going to be hardened and you're going to be destroyed. And that is, if we just keep reading, Paul's going to then come eventually to verse 30, and you will see how the whole thing, ends there. Okay, and it's not pretty. Remember we talked about this, chapter 11, about the kindness and the severity of God. Severity upon those who did not believe, but kindness upon you who did believe. So that's important, and we will continue. Okay, and I do still think it's important here that we engage with those with whom we may not agree with, and I think Musa is one of the best interpreters of the opposite interpretation, and he says this here: the diatribe style becomes more pronounced in this next paragraph, and he follows it to verse 23. Paul explicitly quotes his interlocutor, "You will then say to me," and answers the objections raised in the questions of verse 19b with a series of rhetorical questions of his own in 20a, 21, and 22 to 23. Paul's sharp response to the questions of verse 19 suggests that the interlocutor here is an opponent and not just a dialogue partner, and he's referring back to Stowers and all that. So good on move there. The objector wonders how God can still, that is, assuming the truth of Paul's teaching in verse 18, find fault with people. For who resists his will? Embodied in these questions is the objection that God's sovereign act of hardening, verse 18b, jeopardizes the clear biblical teaching about the justice of God's judgment on people who resist him. And then he does mention here Romans 1:19 to 23 about God, giving people over to their sin, which is another identical way of saying hardening. It's the same thing. It's judicial hardening. For only if people are responsible for their own actions can God's judgment be truly just. Yet Paul's teaching about the sovereignty of God in hardening appears to remove such responsibility. So you need to know that this is where Moo parks it right here. And I'm going to read this again. For only if people are responsible for their own actions can God's judgment be truly just. That's one line. Yet Paul's teaching about the sovereignty of God in hardening appears to remove such responsibility. Just pop down here at the bottom. Paul is content to hold the truths of God's absolute sovereignty in both election and hardening, and of full human responsibility without reconciling them. We would do well to emulate his approach. Well, I would like to say absolutely no. Because, as you noted here, Dr. Moo, back here in Romans 1:19 to 23, and if when you go to Exodus 33:19, I shall be merciful to whom I will be merciful, and I will be gracious, and I'll show compassion to whom I show compassion. So when you can't read that. No Hebrew reader could ever read that and not jump down to the following, the fulfillment of that prophetic word that God gave in the theophany that was about to happen. Okay, and so it's all about how can I be pleasing, how Moses wanted to know how to be pleasing to God, to find favor so that he would know his ways and find favor with God going forward. Well, it's when you know the character of God and that he's gracious and kind and loving and forgiving, but to those who don't cooperate with the grace of God, but they want to live not according to their sinful ways, God by no means will clear the guilty. He visits the sin of the fathers upon the sons, and upon the sons' sons to the third and fourth generation. So this is where our interlocutor is gone south, and this is where Moo fails to understand the nature of God, and we know that God's nature is that He's a God. The very first thing, He's a God of graciousness and compassion. That's Yahweh, God of compassion and graciousness, long suffering, great in loving kindness and truth, maintaining loving kindness or loyalty to thousands, forgiving iniquity, transgression, and sin. So that right there. So God's disposition to all, that's His disposition to all. And we know that, Dr. Moo, because we read the very last verse, 11:32, in this whole section, the epigram, that God has imprisoned all in disobedience in order that He may show mercy to all. And the all means all there. Okay, He imprisoned all. That means all. That means all peoples. So that means God has shown His prevenient grace of mercy to all. Okay, and they rejected it, and that's the reason why Paul doesn't answer this fool. You don't answer a fool according to his folly here. Okay, and Paul had already answered this. In 14 and in 15 and 16, in those verses where he shows He's merciful to those He's merciful to, and He's gracious to those who He's gracious to. And that stems right out of here. And God's disposition to all is to be, He imprisoned all to disobedience in order He may show mercy to all. So I don't find that we have to be in limbo here. If you know who God is, then we know I know what God's will is here. It's knowing His person. There it is. It's right there in Exodus 34, 6 and 7. It couldn't be any plainer, and Paul repeats that here. And 32 confirms it, that this is God's disposition to all. So now we'll move on here in what Moose says. Before analyzing what Paul does say in response to this objection, we do well to note what he does not say. He makes no reference to human works or human faith. Well, we just saw that human faith, the God who calls. Okay, so Dr. Moo, you need to go back and just simply read, verse 12, back there, in a couple verses back, where, it said that in order that the purpose of God, according to election, may continue, not of works, but of the one who calls. And then, just like we said before, read verse 24. Us also whom he called, not only of the Jews, but also of the Gentiles. So what's the calling? Well, that's the call to hear the gospel. That's the good news. So human faith is not a work. It's the God who calls. That's a part of the elective, God's purposes of election. It works. It operates according to calling. And so God calls and people respond. Dr. Moo, it's that simple. So you failed to correctly interpret 6 to 13, and then that messed up everything for you. Once you fail there, then your whole interpretation going forward, it falls flat. And this is what we see in looking at Dr. Moo here. Whether foreseen or not, as the basis of God's act of hardening, so also many of Paul's defenders have done. Nor does he diffuse the issue by confining God's hardening only to the matter of salvation history. Quite the contrary. Verse 22 to 23 make more explicit than ever that Paul is dealing with questions of eternal destiny. In fact, Paul never offers here or anywhere else a logical solution to the tension between divine sovereignty and human responsibility that he creates. Well, Paul already, showed you that, Dr. Moo. You even knew it. It was right back here. You made reference to it. In Romans 1:19 to 23, where God passed over those who continued in their sin. And that's what happened to Pharaoh. Pharaoh hardened his own heart, and then God after that subsequently hardened his heart even more so, and to the point where God just said, I'm going to just stretch this out, and I'm going to multiply my miracles and my wonders so that my name might be known, and my power might be exercised in the earth, that people obviously would fear, and they would recognize that Yahweh is God, and that he rules over the affairs of mankind. And that's Yahweh's prerogative, and so we've already seen here, God doesn't harden unhardened, unsinful people. God only hardens sinful people who continue in their sin, and so he got him. Pharaoh got himself. He enslaved a whole nation. Remember, Joseph had done something very good for the Egyptians, and Pharaoh and his previous forefathers enslaved them, and so in third and fourth generation, Yahweh just destroyed, these people who hated Yahweh. They were sun worshipers, they were idolaters, and God destroyed Egypt, and that's what happens to idol worshipers. God hardens them and destroys them. Okay, then moving right along here, looking diagrammatically at our text here. So what's happened in Paul's diatribal rhetoric, he has placed two questions in the mouth of his interlocutor. And then what he's doing now is he's going to then give three rejoinders. He's going to answer back to his Jewish interlocutor with three of his own rhetorical questions. So that's what's going on here, and this all begins here in 20a here. And it begins here with this interjection here, and then we have the vocative of address, anthrope, and then we have this emphatic compound particle, men unge. So it's basically made up of three different words here. But these are all placed here on stilts here, and then we have our baseline down here, and begins with the personal pronoun su, and then it's followed here. We have this substantival participle that is in apposition to su here. Who are you who answers back? And then we have this, we have the interrogative pronoun here that is functioning as a predicate nominative here, tis. So this is all of the grammatical stuff that we should cover here. And then, so the sentence says, oh man, who are you, on the contrary, who answers back to God? And so when we have this here, this menunge here, this compound emphatic particle, it's used in argumentation to correct what precedes. So the two questions that were, that Paul placed in the mouth of his interlocutor, that was, the previous verse here in 19, shall you therefore say, to me, then why does he yet find fault? And then his basis question, for who resists his plan or his intention, his boulemati. And that probably goes all the way back there to prothesis, the purpose of God in accordance with election. So that boulemati, for who withstands his plans or his intentions. This is this plan or this intention of that is in accordance with the elective purposes of God. So that you got to remember, this is all tightly woven together. But Paul utterly here, menunge here, and the vocative address here, oh, who are you? Oh man. So basically Paul's denying, his interlocutor's previous questions, because remember we said that why does he still, find fault? Well, the Jewish person, is just not accepting the answers because that he still finds fault with you because you're seeking, by works, the calling of God, and the calling of God is not is not to be responded to by works, but by faith. And that's what's going on here in this whole context. So we'll move on to then the next two questions that use the use of illusion. Okay, then to piggyback here on Thielman here, to underscore what we just said, when Paul says here then that God hardens people, he must mean that God justly punishes people who, like Pharaoh and everyone else, are already in rebellion against him. God punishes them by calcifying this rebellion. Or to put it another way, he further hardens resistant hearts. This second level of resistance, which God himself initiates, is Paul's concern here, and it corresponds exactly to God's judgment in 1:24, 26, and 28, when he hands people over to their lusts, dishonorable passion, and worthless thoughts. So this is very important to understand that when he says here, why does he yet find fault? Well, Pharaoh hardened his own heart first. You can read here what Thielman has to say. He makes some excellent comments here, and I really appreciate Thielman for his level of scholarship, and I would direct your attention here, so that this is why Paul is going to then he's correcting the false inference of his Jewish interlocutor, because he should have known that Pharaoh had been in serious rebellion against God and against his purposes. And so when God hardened his heart, it wasn't as if Pharaoh hadn't already hardened his heart. And that's exactly the contention here of Thielman, and this is the direction that we're going in. Okay, then coming in here, looking here diagrammatically, and so we're looking at a bifurcated compound a sentence here, a pair of interrogatives that he's joining together. That the potter and clay theme unites these two together, and so Paul's switching his going from the creation to the creator, of the previous verse. Now he's going to then use a different analogy of the potter and clay to underscore the same theme. And so the sentence runs, that which is formed shall not say to the one who forms, why have you made me in this manner? And so it's the use of may here is it's the interrogative marker of negation, so it's drawing the answer no. So of course the that which is made shall not say to the one who made it, to the one who made, why have you made me in this manner? So it's a ridiculous question, but it's often what humans do, and they question and they try to second guess what God's doing, and so Paul here is basically putting this gentleman by the use of illusion, and so this illusion here is what we would call a midrashic complex. It is the first part of the verse here, like this part here, would be coming from Isaiah 29:16. And then in the direct discourse here, why have you made me in this way? It doesn't follow Isaiah 29:16 following, but it rather picks up on Isaiah 45 and about verse 9. And so we'll look at these texts here, and we'll see the logic of what he's doing. Now when we look down here, when we have or, so he's going to then now offer a second question, but now ook, which expects this is the interrogative marker expecting the answer yes here, ook. Does not the potter have authority over the clay to make from the same lump one a vessel for honor and another for dishonor? And so he has a negative a question here that's both expecting the answer no, and then one expecting the answer yes. So he's back into this bifurcated way of questioning his Jewish interlocutor, and it's very ingenious to throw off negative and positive questions like that, and it's to cover all bases. And this one here now. This here is a midrashic complex, most likely stemming from the wisdom of Solomon in 15:7-8, and also includes, we would just put Jeremiah 18 in here and to explain this. And so does not the potter have authority over the clay? And then we have poiesi here. This is this epexegetical infinitive. It just draws out the, coming here from exousion, from authority. He has authority to make from the same clay, or the same lump here. And then we have this predicate accusative here. And we have the relative pronoun here in the neuter accusative here and here, and we have skeuos here, which is a likewise it's a neuter accusative, and it's in this predicate accusative relationship here, and we have this men de along with the relative pronoun ha here, which coordinates a correlative compound, and so we would translate this one a vessel for honor, and another, and then we have to supply vessel for dishonor, and that's how we would look at this diagrammatically here in verses 20b to 21. And we're going to look a little more closely here at these midrashic complexes. And that is the bringing together of two disparate passages to combine them into one, which makes a new theologomena, a new theological construct. So we'll just get a little here from James Dunn in his commentary. He says the following: Me ere ta plasma to plasanti timi epoiesas hutos. And then he translates it, does the thing made say to its maker, why have you made me thus? The first 6 words are drawn verbatim from the LXX of Isaiah 29:16, but the actual question adapts the following straight denial in Isaiah ou sume plasas to a protest more appropriate to the train of argument here, perhaps with conscious allusion to T poies of Isaiah 45:9. The correlation of themes, including that of the potter in both passages, would naturally bring them in close association with Paul's mind. And I would be in full agreement with this. But what's important here is to look at these passages and see what they mean in context, and that's where we'll be looking. But I just wanted to put James Dunn here on record that he understands that Paul's is alluding here to these passages. Okay, then coming then to this slide, we're going to then look at Paul's elusive use of Scripture, because he doesn't state here, that he's quoting Scripture. He's just using it, and then we're going to look at this, so Paul, we're looking here at Paul's responses to the objector here in verses 20 to 21. And Paul's initial question we saw here, "O man, on the contrary, who are you to answer back to God?" So that's coming from the creator creation, comparison here, so that, obviously the human, humans as the creatures have. In no way can we question what the Creator is doing with us, and that just goes back. Remember to the question, because there is no injustice with God, is there? And the answer is there is no injustice. So going off from the Bekenntnis formal or the affirmation formula that we know who God is, that He's gracious and kind, and forgiving iniquity, transgression, and sin to the compliant, but to the non-compliant, the Scripture said that that He by no means clears the guilty, but that visits the sins of the father upon the third and fourth generation. So we've already talked about that, and that is that's very, very important for understanding this. So since God has been, Paul says there's no injustice with God, is there? And of course there isn't. And so now he's going to then, after we've already established, Paul's established here that there is no injustice with God. So now then, Paul is so there's some type of this objector that Paul, is responding to here. Obviously, he's still in the position of not cooperating with God, and because he's questioning from a obviously from a position of hardening, okay? Because we've already established that God forgives, and He's kind and He's merciful. That's who God is, and so if a person is not being shown to be kind, if God deals with somebody not in the way that God has described Himself back there in Exodus, well then the person is guilty of gross sin and non-cooperation with God's graciousness and kindness and mercifulness, and since God forgives iniquity, transgression, and sin. Okay, so that is how we're to understand this. That was all done in back there in 14 to 18. And then it's just continuing on, why does He yet still find fault? And so if God has hardened somebody because they've repeatedly hardened their heart, such as Pharaoh, and that analogy is going to show up in 22 to 24. Okay, that whole analogy of the Exodus is still in the back of Paul's mind here. And we'll see that how he applies these rhetorical questions that we're working on right here in 20 to 21, and then in 22 to 24, then he's going to make an application of what we're looking at right now. He's going to apply it in a hypothetical analogy here in 22 to 24. Very, very important that you understand this point. Now, coming into this elusive use of Scripture here, if you look right here, this right here is a quote. This is from Isaiah, and this is 29, okay? And we're looking here at verse 16 here, okay? And then to get the context, this comes in a woe statement, looking at verse 15. Woe to those who go deep from Yahweh to hide counsel, and their works are in darkness. And they say, who sees us, or who knows us? You have turned things upside down. Shall the potter be esteemed as the clay? That the work says to the one who made him, you have not made me, or that which is formed to the one who formed him, he has no understanding. So that would be the way to translate this from the Hebrew text. Now, looking at how the Septuagint slightly modifies this, woe to those who make deep counsels, and not of the Spirit, or excuse me, not by the Lord. Woe to those who make counsel in secret, and their works are in darkness, and who say, who has seen us, and who knows us, right? And then here we have, or what we are doing. And then shall not you be considered as the clay of the potter? That which is formed does not say to the one who formed it, you have not made me, or that which is made to the maker, you have not made me intelligently, have you? So it's expecting the answer no. And then this little quote right here is what we see down here in our text. So this comes straight out of, Paul's definitely making this allusion straight out of, out of Isaiah 29:16. So this is where Paul's fishing, and he's using this use of may here that expects the answer no, because when we come down here to Paul, oh man, on the contrary, who are you to answer back to God? That which is formed shall not say to the one who formed, why have you made me in this way, does he? And the answer is supposed to be no. So then we have here this, then the next question, this one expects the answer no, and then Paul's next question expects the answer yes. Okay. And so that's what Paul's using here is the contrast of questions of one expecting the answer no and the other expecting the answer yes. It's a contrast here to expose the objector here, and from either a positive or negative type questioning. And it just widens the sphere of possibilities, and that's why Paul would he would do this, and and so we know for a fact that he's quoting from there. Now, other scholars here are looking here then to Isaiah 45:9 following, and we'll look at the Hebrew text. Woe to the one who strives with his maker, the potsherd with the potsherds of the earth. We'll say here the clay does not say to the one who formed him, "What are you doing?" And your work, it has no handles. That would be a good way to translate this. And then woe to the one who says to a father, "What are you begetting?" And to a mother, "What are you giving birth pangs to?" So of course, somebody, this is the absurdity here of questioning what God is doing. So we definitely want to, make sure that we're understanding these texts from, God's sovereignty. Okay, and so God is just in whatever He does. We've already seen His character. His character was on display back there. I'll be merciful unto whom I'm merciful, and I'll be gracious to whom I'm gracious. And then it says He'll harden whom He hardens. That's all taken directly from the the understanding of the Exodus 33:34 text. Okay, that pointed to definitely you can't read Exodus 33:19 without bringing into play Exodus 34:6-7. That's an impossibility for any this is definitely in Paul's mind here, and just remember that Paul ends his whole discussion here in 11:32, and he wraps it all up in the epigram, where he says that that God has imprisoned all in disobedience in order that He might show mercy to all. So the character of God is to show every single human being kindness and graciousness. He doesn't pass over some, and shows mercy to others. No, God shows mercy to all, and then after having shown mercy to all, He passes over some who don't cooperate with God in the process of life. And then that's how they're passed over. That's how come they're hardened. And we'll see that is the way that you are to understand the whole biblical, context here of what's going on in the Bible, and then more narrowly here in Romans, chapters 9 to 11. But it makes complete, total sense in the whole book of Romans as well. And that's how we're to understand this. And so we'll continue on here. And so it's just, we're to look down here. There's negative and positive, elusive, metaphoric, scriptural questions here. And they have this application to the potter and clay here in 20b to 21. So we have, the midrashic complex expecting the answer no, and then the midrashic complex illusion expecting the answer yes. Okay, and so the question expecting the answer yes, or does not the potter have authority over the clay to make from the same lump one for honor, and one vessel for honor and another for dishonor? So this is his next question. So that here now then he's working in these bifurcated thoughts here of God showing mercy on some and hardening others. This is still in view here. So so the potter has definitely authority over the clay to make from the same lump here of whether it be humanity or if he's thinking more in terms of the Jewish community here. It doesn't really matter. It works in any analogy. He's working from a lump of humanity, whereby God, and remember, this now all is interpreting in Paul's present time, ever since verse 14. Okay, the whole patriarchal thing about God choosing this lineage through which he is going to then the gifts and calling of God were expressed through this lineage that God created through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And that's truly what it is. It's they were given the gifts and calling of God. That's what that means there in chapter 11. The gifts and calling God go back to this calling of this nation, Israel. Okay, and they were given the gifts and the calling of God, and that was what we saw there back in in chapter 9 verses 1 through 5. More specifically, verse 4 there where he lists all of the gifts and the calling there of Israel. Okay. And so it's just, you got to understand the whole context of this, so here obviously no one's going to question the potter's authority that he has over the clay to make from it, one a vessel for honor and another for dishonor. So, of course, God is going to do that, and obviously we're dealing with the righteous versus the wicked here, and that's what he's saying here, and it makes all the sense in the world, and we just follow this, and I don't think anyone's questioning, no one's questioning the potter's right, the Creator's right here. The Creator's right in whatever he does, and so then in the application of the present time of the apostle, now he's talking in generalities here of the two ways here that mankind take, and that God ultimately is the potter who fires and hardens the clay into whatever shape we'll say that the clay determined for itself. Okay, then coming then to this slide, we're looking here at Jeremiah 18:1, and it's pretty hard to not, anytime the image of the potter and clay comes up in the Old Testament, this is the most famous passage that would be in the back of everyone's mind, as well as Paul's. And there's no better text to understand that there is no injustice with God when God as the potter deals with the clay of humanity. And this text shows us just exactly how the potter and clay analogy works in the Old Testament. And the word of Yahweh came to Jeremiah from Yahweh, saying, "Arise, go down to the house of the potter, and there I shall cause you to hear my word." And I went down to the house of the potter, and behold, he was making a work upon the stones. So these are the stones that, he puts the clay on and spins it, one with his foot and the other with the clay above. And the vessel which he was working with in clay became marred in the hand of the potter. And he turned and he made another vessel as it was upright in the eyes of the to do in the eyes of the potter. And the word of Yahweh came to me, saying, am I not able, as this potter, to do to you, O house of Israel, declares the Lord? Behold, as the clay in the hand of the potter, thus are you in my hands, O house of Israel. In an instant I will speak concerning a nation and concerning a kingdom, to uproot and to throw down and to destroy. And if that nation, turns from its evil, which I spoke against it, and I shall relent concerning the evil which I considered to do to it. And in an instant I speak concerning a nation and concerning a kingdom, to build and to plant. And it does evil in my eyes, so as not to listen to my voice. And I will relent concerning the good which I spoke to do good to it. Now, say to the house, or say now to each one of the men of Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem, saying, thus says Yahweh, behold, I am forming against you evil, and I am considering against you thoughts, and believe me, they're not good. Turn now each one from his evil way, and make your ways and your deeds good. And so this is how we are, this is how that we are to deal with things. The potter's just not making, some vessels, for wrath. He created them specifically to wipe them all out, and others he specifically made to make them vessels of honor and glory. Okay. God is not an evil, and he's not capricious, and he's not arbitrary. Okay. God deals, with nations or with individuals in accordance with his nature, and we saw that God was in and of himself, without anybody manipulating God in any way. God is so gracious that we saw in the epigram of 1132 that God imprisoned all to disobedience in order that he might show mercy to all. So there's no vessel that can say that God never showed me mercy so as that I could turn. And this is the analogy here from Jeremiah. And this is how we're to understand everything. And especially, Paul's use of Exodus 32:9, and then, Paul's capstone back there in 11:32 of Romans, where we just quoted from, so that God shows mercy to all, and then, and if you're not, cooperating with God's Spirit, then he will harden an individual, as in the case of Pharaoh. And then now what Paul's going to do is then make the application of this whole potter and clay business in the following verses. Okay, now then coming into this particular next sequence here that Paul does, he leaves off his three questions, and now what he's going to do, he's going to make an application of the analogies of the potter and clay, and we would understand this as the Exodus motif of Pharaoh and Israel. And so all of this is kind of being wrapped up here. Everything from 14 there with Pharaoh and the vessels of mercy, that God hardened, or that he showed mercy to, and then the vessels of wrath that he hardened. These are all being wrapped up in this hypothetical question here. And we got to know here that what Paul's doing here, we have the use here of his ellipses here. The use of ellipsis is just, Paul fails to, this is an if then, conditional sentence that he's creating. And Paul gives the if part, but he never supplies the then part. But since we're talking about God, then of course whatever the if part is, the then part is completely possible. And we'll look at two different ways of reading it. But we'll start here. But if God, and then we're gonna jump straight down here into the adverbial use of the participle here. And we can understand it concessively or causatively or even by by means here. And we'll just look at means here. But if God, by desiring, okay, and then we'll say to demonstrate wrath and to make known his power, okay. All right, so we see this here. He bore with vessels of mercy in much patience, which have been, and then we're saying here for this particular perfect participle, which have been retooled, okay, or repurposed, okay, or reformed. And I do believe that these three here bring out the meaning here of this perfect. And we're going to say ultimately this is passive, a passive participle. But it was, they had reformed themselves, and God was having mercy upon them, through patience, and ultimately God formed them or reformed them and repurposed them and retooled them for destruction. Absolutely, there's no way around that. And then we're using, so thelon here, the adverbial is being two-timed here, and by desiring, in order that he might make known the riches of his glory upon vessels of mercy, which he prepared beforehand for glory, us whom he also called, not only of the Jews, but also of the Gentiles. So we have to, this is ultimately included in here because Paul wants to now include the Gentiles in with with Israel, okay, and then that becomes the focus following. But verse 24 is included here by means of the relative, the relative clause here that connects it here back to vessels here, vessels of mercy, okay, and then also the vessels of mercy that he was preparing beforehand, so for glory, okay. So you could see here then how God was, he knew that Egypt, the Pharaoh was going to harden his heart and not allow Israel to go because they had hegemony and they had Israel in slavery, and they just weren't going to then just nicely cooperate with God, since we're talking about Pharaoh here, the guy who worships the sun, and and he's considered divine in some sense here. So this was a good way for God then to make known his name, and so that it would be proclaimed in all the earth, and that God would demonstrate his power upon these wicked, evil vessels of the Egyptians, and who were retooled and repurposed, and were repurposed, reformed for destruction. I mean, they this is what they created. You can understand this. At first, it was the middle that the clay formed itself into, and then after they had hardened themselves, then God said, okay, it's time to fire them. It's time to fire this clay and harden them into vessels of wrath here, which he basically destroyed in the 10 plagues and in the sea here. So this is very, very important here, and that sometimes God in history shows salvation by an evil, wicked people trying to destroy God's own people, and then when God saves God's own people, then this is how then God made his name known, and that he demonstrated his power upon these, and by doing that, this is how his name was proclaimed. And you don't let a good, crisis go to waste here, so to speak. And then, then God made known the riches of his glory upon the vessels of mercy. And then, so everybody in the ancient world, respected and feared Israel and saw that they were objects of God's mercy, that God had preserved and to show his glory. So this is the perfect analogy that the apostle uses here, but such analogies don't work towards some type of superlapsarianism of double predestination. That's all that's eisegetically read into all of this, this material. God's not unjust, and God's not a monster. And if you're hooked on that way, then that's your dealy bob. But I've read 11:32. God shut up all. He's imprisoned all in disobedience in order that he might show mercy upon all. So God shows mercy upon every vessel. He showed mercy upon Pharaoh by saying, "Let my people go," 10 different times, and he wouldn't do it. And so, eventually God says, "Turn up the heat. Let's throw them in the oven. Let's bake it." And now you're destroyed. You're a vessel of, you're going to be a vessel that's smashed and crashed in the Red Sea. Okay, then some scholars here would, looking here diagrammatically, would put in here, but if, what shall we say, if God, desiring to demonstrate wrath and to make known his power, bore in much patience, vessels of wrath which have been prepared for destruction, or retooled for destruction, and he did so in order that. So this is where they're coming in here with the apodosis, and he did so by putting in here epoiesin. And then we have the purpose clause, in order that he might make known upon vessels of mercy the riches of his glory, which he prepared beforehand for glory, whom us also he called, not only of the Jews but also of the Gentiles. So this is how then the if we were to, include the apodosis, this would be done. And this would be the other way of understanding this. And this would be following somewhat of William Ramey's understanding diagrammatically. All right, this has been another session of biblical theology, exegesis, and hermeneutics, where meaning is always context-driven. Please like, share, subscribe, and hopefully this has been a blessing to you. That's why I'm doing this, and it's just I just love looking at the text and looking at the structure and grammar and all. Obviously, we have to come to grips with the meaning as it's driven by the context.